One of the more interesting quirks of military aviation was converting wheeled aircraft into floatplanes. Several militaries would do this, most notably in the Second World War period. On the one hand, it was seen as a way of extending the range of scout aircraft. On the other, it could be a quick and easy way to get light scouts for use on warships. And on the third mutant hand, it could give you fighters where airfields weren't a viable option. You saw this in the Royal Navy with swordfish carried on battleships. Warspite famously used a float swordfish at Narvik. Meanwhile, in the United States, there were failed attempts at this idea, the most famous being the Wild Catfish, a converted F4F Wildcat. But the Vindicator also had a floatplane variant. However, the most famous of this type is by far the Japanese option, the A6M2-N Allied reporting name Rufe, a Mitsubishi Zero fitted with floats. This is where the third option came in. The Japanese saw a need for fighters on distant island bases, ones where they couldn't build an airfield, or at the least where it was too inefficient. Alternatively, for forward operations where airfields had yet to be built. In this regard, the Rufe would prove quite versatile, particularly in areas where land-based aviation wasn't readily available. That said, it would also demonstrate all the liabilities of such a concept. The floats made the Zero into a less than effective fighter. Rufes would often suffer when forced to engage more traditional aircraft, simply because they couldn't keep up. As a result, it would have a short time in production, and relatively few would be built. Even so, it's an interesting detour in military aviation, and one that I think deserves covering, so that's what we'll be looking at today. Starting, of course, with why Nakajima was building a floatplane version of the Mitsubishi Zero. This is a story that began in the fall of 1940 when the Japanese Navy issued a new specification, in this case for a single-seat floatplane fighter. There were various reasons for this proposal. For example, the Japanese had gotten good use out of floatplanes in China, particularly the Kawanishi E7K and Nakajima E8N, both of which gave useful service as scouts or bombers. So the potential for floatplanes in combat was definitely noted. Moreover, it was recognized that expanding into the Pacific presented its own challenges. For example, amphibious assaults. Japan's carrier fleet couldn't always be present. Having a floatplane fighter provide air cover was a good compromise. The same went, of course, for protecting far-flung island bastions that couldn't support an airfield. These factors led to the Navy requesting designs in 1940. It isn't entirely clear how many proposals were made, but one design was ultimately accepted, the Kawanishi N1K1. This was an advanced monoplane fighter with an interesting story all its own. Most notably, the fact that the N1K1 would end up being the reverse of the situation today. It began as a floatplane fighter, yet it would later be converted into a land-based configuration, and in so doing, become one of Japan's best late-war fighters. But that's a story for another day. For today, the relevant point is this. While the Japanese Navy was quite impressed with Kawanishi's design, it was a ways off. This design was accepted in September 1940. However, it would be 18 months before the first prototype was completed, and it only flew on May 6, 1942. The Japanese didn't want to wait that long, so an interim design was required. With this in mind, the Japanese Navy approached Nakajima, not to develop a fresh design, but to convert the excellent Mitsubishi A6M2-Zero. This was a fighter that had already proven itself in combat over China. Moreover, Nakajima was a proven company that delivered aircraft when asked. Perhaps more importantly, however, it had far more spare production capacity. As the logic went, the Zero was an exceptional fighter. Nakajima had building room to spare, and slapping floats on the Zero should have been a much simpler thing to do compared to a new design. Nakajima was approached to do this work in late 1940. By February 1941, they had started modifying an A6M2 Model 11 fighter. At this time, the prototype was known as the AS-1. Work would progress on this design over the course of 1941 as Nakajima's engineers set about their duty. First, they removed the landing gear and covered over the wheel wells. Those were useless for a floatplane. Then the engineers attached a large central float fitted in place by a forward-sloping pylon, as well as a V-strut behind that. A fairly modest set of struts, but this was intended to reduce drag. In addition, two smaller stabilizing floats were fitted to the wings. These were simple affairs, slightly angled up and attached by a single strut. Once again, part of the effort to reduce drag. Unfortunately, there was only so much that could be done in that regard, as we'll see when we reach the performance. Beyond this, very little changed about the AS-1 compared to the A6M2. The fuselage and wings remained identical, as did the weaponry for that matter. The only structural change outside of the removal of the landing gear was to the tail. The vertical surfaces were enlarged and a small ventral fin was installed on the bottom. Or more accurately, two fins. They were split by the rudder. So when the prototype was completed, it was, by and large, an A6M2 with floats and a slightly modified tail. The later designation of A6M2N makes sense in this regard. The existing A6M2 with Nakajima's N slapped on the end. It was certainly far less of a modification compared to the Vindicator floatplane, or even more so, the Wild Catfish. As such, it should be little surprise that the prototype took to the sky within 10 months of proper development starting. This began in February 1941. The prototype's first flight was in December 1941. More accurately, it was on December 8th, 1941. December 7th on the Hawaii side of the international dateline. Yes, the first flight of the A6M2N was within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, one of those historical quirks that crop up here and there. In any event, the Japanese Navy considered the aircraft a success. An order was placed with Nakajima for 500 of the new fighters. Not a small number for what was, in the end, a specialized aircraft, and moreover a stopgap as the N1K1 continued its protracted development. As it would turn out, however, Nakajima couldn't meet the demand. They had more production capacity, but that was quickly being put to use, building their own aircraft like the Ki-43 Oscar, or the B-5N and B-6N torpedo bombers, as well as others as the war developed. Not to mention building a lot of more traditional Zeros as Mitsubishi's production lines were quickly tapped out. In the end, only 327 A6M2Ns would be delivered, which wraps up the background, so let's briefly touch on the design. There won't be a lot to note here, as it is fundamentally a Zero on floats. This aircraft had a wingspan of 12 meters, or 39 feet 4 inches, with a length of 10.1 meters, 33 feet 2 inches, and a height of 4.3 meters, or 14 feet 1 inch. By comparison, a standard A6M2 was 9.06 meters, 29 feet 9 inches long, with a height of 3.05 meters, or 10 feet. The wingspan was identical. As you can see, the only noteworthy changes are to the length and the tail height. Another difference came in the weight. The A6M2N had an empty weight of 1,912 kilograms, 4,215 pounds, with a maximum takeoff weight of 2,460 kilograms, or 5,423 pounds. The standard carrier model was 1,680 kilograms, or 3,704 pounds empty, with a maximum weight of 2,796 kilograms, or 6,164 pounds. A bit lighter empty, but a bit heavier at its maximum takeoff weight. As for the performance, this is where things really deviate. The A6M2N could reach 435 kilometers per hour, or 270 miles per hour. The base model was capable of 553 kilometers per hour, or 331 miles per hour. Both aircraft use the same Nakajima NK1C 14-cylinder engine, capable of 950 horsepower. The difference in performance is down entirely to the drag from the floats. The service ceiling, meanwhile, remained the same, 10,000 meters or 33,000 feet for both. However, even with fuel in the central float, the A6M2N had a shorter range, 1,148 kilometers, 713 miles, compared to 1,870 kilometers, or 1,160 miles. Either way, this wraps up the differences. As noted before, both aircraft had the same weaponry, two 7.7mm machine guns in the nose and two 20mm cannon in the wings, along with the ability to carry two 60-kilogram, 132-pound bombs. So, with that rounding off the design, let's move on to service. It's here where the promise of the A6M2N faltered in the face of reality. You see, while production began in April 1942, the aircraft only really began to see service towards the end of the year. By this point, their original role, covering amphibious landings and operating from forward bases, was largely redundant. Soon after the type entered production, you had the double whammy of Coral Sea and Midway, in May and June 1942, respectively. Those battles put an end to Japanese expansion, which meant the A6M2N was relegated to defensive duty. Now, don't get me wrong, the aircraft still had its uses in such a role, particularly in the Aleutian Islands, where the Japanese lacked proper airfields. Exactly how effective they were does vary from source to source. They are commonly cited as useful because of the lack of proper fighters, and they would remain in the area from August 1942 through at least April 1943. Beyond this, I'd say the A6M2N, by now codenamed Rufe, was most famous for the Solomon campaign. In particular, a group was dispatched to Tulagi, as the Japanese had yet to build an airfield on Guadalcanal. Most of these Rufes were destroyed when the invasion of Guadalcanal took place in August 1942. Other Rufes would operate from different bases in the Solomons, consistently patrolling and contesting airspace against American fighters, up to and including the odd raid on Henderson Field. They would also operate off the seaplane tender Kamikawa Maru, something the Rufe had never been designed for. Nonetheless, the aircraft proved up to the challenge. For example, downing an SPD Dauntless on September 13, 1942. Between September 4th and November 7th, the aircraft flew 360 sorties, claiming 14 Allied aircraft for 9 losses, though how accurate this figure is can definitely be debated. Kamikawa Maru would continue to support Solomon operations through the rest of the year, with at least one pilot, Keizo Yamazaki, claiming a P-38. However, the type's limitations were already becoming apparent. Namely, they were slower and less agile than Zeros, which meant they lost the advantage that the Zero had over Wildcats. While Rufes remained a credible threat, they were also of questionable utility put up against modern fighters, something that only grew more problematic as time went on. When Hellcats and Corsairs joined the fray, the Japanese wisely pulled their surviving Rufes back. At first to bases like Truk, where quite a few were downed by Hellcat night fighters. If you've watched dogfights, you know what I mean. Others would be lost up and down Japan's shrinking defense barrier, resulting in a shrinking number as the type went out of production in September 1943, when the N1K1 finally entered service. Ultimately, the Rufe would end out the war in the home islands, mostly on training duty, with some used as interceptors when nothing else was available. To my knowledge, none of the types survive as museum pieces, although one A6M2-N was captured in French Indochina and put to use with the French Navy in 1945. This one saw limited service before being lost in a crash on February 19, 1946. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.